been turned out and not enough real engineers.
Yeah.
My Lords, I too appreciate that Noble Lord Eatwell has tabled this debate. It feels at last the productivity problem and the issue of the lack of business investment is being discussed, because for too long many economic policies have amounted to financial tinkering or rows over distribution. Meanwhile, growth has been demonised as either bad for well-being or destructive of the planet, and even those espousing growth rhetoric have often neglected productivity. But it is only in raising productivity that we have the basis for improving living standards and a vehicle for new, skilled, well-paid employment opportunities rather than low-paid, insecure, unskilled jobs. Productivity increases are the only way we will escape our high debt and low-growth economic trap. Until recently, we've been in denial. Productivity started flatlining before the 2008 financial crisis, and indeed before Brexit. But throughout the last decade and a half, politicians of all stripes have repeatedly claimed that the British economy was fundamentally sound and robust, and arguments instead have concentrated on how it was managed. It took the triple whammy of lockdown and the post-lockdown disruption of global supply chain and the war in Ukraine to finally force the political class to admit we have a problem and put growth on the agenda. But note, whether lockdown or war, these recent global events are not to blame for the state we're in. The UK was affected badly precisely because our internal productive capacities have been hollowed out by decades-old deindustrialisation and our dependence on imported goods, which means much less domestic scope to compensate for foreign supply shortages. To illustrate this point, look at the contrast with Asia, which has been better able to offset supply bottlenecks, because as developing countries, Asian countries are building up, not eroding, their domestic productiveness, and that gives them more adaptability in the face of global disruptions. As a result, consumer prices in lots of Asian countries have not risen as much as in the West, and there's a lesson there. One nagging question I have, though: could narrowly focusing on inflation levels become a distraction from deeper protracted problems? Surely tweaks to monetary policy can't fix the productivity slump. Quite the opposite. After all, it was central banks' monetary policies and cheap borrowing from 2008 that camouflaged and extended productive decay. The Bank of England pumped masses of liquidity into the economy and created all sorts of price bubbles and printed money to fund government's huge pandemic shutdown and never uttered a word of opposition to the wholesale closure of the economy. But despite the temptation to indulge in bank bashing, it actually lets culpable politicians off the hook to do this. Ever since Gordon Brown made the Bank of England independent in 1997, successive governments have willfully outsourced their responsibility for economic decisions and distanced themselves from, for example, interest rates. And worse, it's turned national economic policy making into a seemingly technocratic exercise, far removed from democratic accountability or voters' influence. I say this must change. It's time the state assumed transparent responsibility by taking back control of the Bank of England, and so I want more state there in running the economy. But in terms of productivity, I think perhaps we need less state intervention. I get nervous when the Tories and Labour, in different ways, seem to think that government should take an active role in business, whatever form it takes, whether industrial subsidies, tax incentives or public investment. My fear is that this will hinder the very innovation it's meant to promote. State aid damagingly sustains a business status quo that can keep inefficient, low-productive firms afloat. This zombified economy is the antithesis of dynamic, future-orientated innovation. These state policies, the state aid, monetary, fiscal and regulatory, tend to favour larger legacy companies at the expense of smaller start-ups that would usually be more inventive, experimental and likely to drive productivity higher. State handouts encourage corporate dependence, in other words, and reduce pressure on business to become competitive, blunting the incentive to experiment and develop better technologies. And state support often comes with political strings, usually prescriptive and distorting business investment activities. My pet hates are those brought on by infernal net zero targets, let alone those dreaded mandated ESG reporting and so on. But there is plenty the state can do to create conditions that will allow investment to flourish. It can invest heavily in public research and science, R&D, as so well described by the noble Lord Eatwell. That is essential for new ideas and technological breakthroughs to occur. It can end the fixation on decarbonisation that narrows the horizons of economic development, as well as costing working people a fortune. It can prioritise cheap, efficient, reliable energy sources from nuclear to North Sea oil. It can focus on infrastructure deficits. For God's sake, let's build some more reservoirs, and we might even get some hydropower out of them. It needs to tackle with urgency the broken and expensive transport system and drop the ideological war on cars, vans, lorries and flight. And by the way, if that means nationalising the railways, I'm all good with that. It means that they drop supporting the NIMBYist antagonism to house building, but ambitiously build new towns, new cities, new sites for newly emerging productive industries, so brilliantly motivated by Baroness Thornwell. And perhaps we also need a productivity cost-benefit analysis on legislation and regulation. Sitting through the Levelling Up Bill and listening to the plethora of amendments suggesting barriers to construction, I think it would be a miracle if anything ever gets built in the future. We need to remove the blocks on construction. And finally, we must stop relying on cheap migrant labour as a solution. We need widespread, long-term training of domestic workers at home, and especially the young.